Thank you. Hi, everybody. So please do grab coffee and break out your pencils and pens because we're about to flex our ethical decision-making muscles in a second. So I need you guys awake and ready. Before I start my short talk and then we get into actually working through a case study, I just want to build on something that Chris Riley said earlier. Because I completely agree with him when he says that we can't just have ethics education for engineers, we need law as well. But we can't just have law either. Because law doesn't always cover, it never covers everything. And while we're coming up and making sure that we have wise laws, and while we're still talking by analogy to older technologies, technologists are going to have to make decisions, and those are going to be ethical decisions in the absence of clarity from the law, while we're waiting for judicial opinions to clarify even what a new law actually says. So it's really, really important to do both. And it's not just a matter of law with a twist of ethics. You just heard Yvonne talk about the kind of power that technologists have, and precisely for that reason, we need them to be really involved in ethical discussions as well. So, diverse faces refers to the case we're actually going to be working through in a second. I'm going to give credit where it's due. I'm a co-author of a lot of these materials. You can find a lot of tech ethics materials on our website, and I'll give the address again as well. So what are we talking about? We've been talking about data ethics and technology ethics. Okay, so here's one definition. Ethics is the theory and practice of living well, doing the right thing in particular circumstances, and being the kind of person you want to be. Just that. It's pretty broad. It's a lot of things, right? But that is what we're talking about when we talk about ethics. When Yvonne was talking about how we need to interrogate ourselves, that's virtue ethics right there. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So ethics involves both knowledge and skills. And at the same time, the knowledge in no way immunizes you against unethical behavior. So you can take lots of ethics classes, and that doesn't mean you're going to be a good person necessarily, but it'll give you the knowledge that maybe hasn't been made explicit in some of the conversations that we've been having so far, right? We've all been making ethical decisions, applied ethics kinds of decisions all our lives, when we negotiate and figure out how to be good partners, good students, good employees, good sons and daughters, and how to express that in our daily life. Now we're talking about making those kind of decisions in the professional context of technology work. Okay. So it involves both knowledge and skills. And the first step toward building an ethical digital ecosystem is to be able to recognize and identify ethical issues. And we're kind of going to concentrate today just on that first step, right? Not through a whole process of making the entire ethical decision, but how do we even see the ethical issues that are facing us? Recognizing them is a skill. And ethical issues are like birds. Okay, what do we mean by that? They're everywhere, but we often don't notice them, right? Some are local, some are exotic, some are ubiquitous. I would argue that privacy issues are becoming sort of the pigeons of this world. We all kind of by now know what they are, right? We know to be on the lookout for privacy issues. We kind of know what they look like. Fairness in applied in machine learning used to be a more exotic bird. It's becoming more recognized, right? If you're in machine learning, you now know that there's a question of bias that we need to be aware of. So some of those questions, some of those issues are becoming more prominent, and we learn to recognize them. It's easy to go through life surrounded by ethical issues and not really recognize them as such. Spotting them is a skill, and practice makes finding them easier. And that's why what we're going to do today is practice that a little bit. Another more reasons how they are like birds. Skilled watchers learn how to see them and where they are more likely to turn up. So you develop a sense in which some of the analysis that we're going to do a little bit awkwardly and kind of very intentionally today, if you do it a lot, it just becomes habit, right? We start to recognize issues more in some areas than others. It's easier to spot them with other watchers, and hopefully I will demonstrate that to you when we talk about these issues in groups a little bit later on. especially those familiar with particular environments. And that's why we're talking about why we need diversity when we look at these issues, and why we need to have people who really understand the ground in which we're expressing and projecting the technology. And some in the wild are hard to see without special lenses. So we're going to talk about ethical lenses in this case. I will try to offer you a tool that I think makes it easier to actually identify and spot these issues. So the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, where I work at Santa Clara University, has something called the Framework for Ethical Decision Making. And you will get a handout with the framework in a second. You'll be able to find it online. And it's basically the closest we come to an ethics algorithm. There is no ethics algorithm, but this is just a way of taking you through a process that is supposed ultimately to lead you to a better decision, in the sense that we don't tell you if it's a more ethical or less ethical decision, but it will be a decision that's more congruent with your own values. Having thought through this and having worked through this process, whatever decision you reach is something that you'll be less likely to regret in the future. You will be able to explain to other people who ask you why you made that particular decision. That's what this aspires to. But we're going to use this framework and its 5 ethical lenses today, again, not so much to guide you to what is the right decision in a particular circumstance, but just to help you identify the issues. By the way, this is not a framework. Many times the right thing to do is pretty obvious. You don't need a whole decision-making process. You can choose to do it or not to do it. But sometimes you really have ethical dilemmas where you're really not sure what the right thing to do is, where you have competing goods, where there are inherent trade-offs. That's where this becomes useful, right? When you really have to work through that. And some of the questions that we're talking about, as we said, around content moderation and other issues, really are complex ethical questions. It's not just that people are choosing not to do the right thing. So the ethical lenses I'm going to talk about, I guess, okay, I'll back up a second. I want you to think of these as Instagram filters. When you have a picture and you apply different filters, different elements of the picture are highlighted, right? It's the same picture. But at the end, having looked at it through different filters, multiple filters, you have a better understanding, okay? So these are 5 filters that we can apply when we look at a particular case or circumstance. The first one is that of rights. So rights are entitlements or liberties. They reflect determinations about what is owed to people. There are moral rights, there are civil rights. Can you give me some example? Just call them out. When you think of rights, what are some rights we talk about all the time? Right to life, privacy. Sorry? Free speech, freedom of assembly, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So these are all rights. This is one ethical lens, one ethical school of thought through which to look at a particular issue. The difficulty, by the way, and one issue I have with human rights lawyers who argue that the right thing to do is not to talk about ethics, but to talk about human rights law, is that human rights law itself is not sufficient, because sometimes rights come into conflict. So you still then have to make a decision about how to prioritize them. I'm a lawyer, by the way, so I care very much about law. Second of the 5 lenses is that of justice and fairness, right? And this focuses on the distribution of benefits and burdens. What is the fair way to distribute those? And treating people equally is ideal, but it's treating equals equally, because sometimes if some people are much stronger than others and you distribute a burden equally, then it's very unfair, right? So just something to keep in mind when you use that particular lens. That's the second lens. The third lens is one that's usually big in Silicon Valley that you hear about, and that's utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism aims to quantify and maximize aggregate happiness. How do you reach as much well-being overall for as many people as possible? Maximizing benefits, minimizing harms, right? Looking at the consequences. A couple of problems with this, and each of these lenses is insufficient and problematic in itself, right? The really useful thing is to apply them all, because each of these has these sort of caveats, right? A few things about utilitarianism. Some things are really hard to quantify. Sometimes the benefits and the harms accrue to different people, not the same group. And sometimes, depending on the timeline that you choose, right? In the short term, you can maximize and minimize the benefits and harms, but it looks differently if you think about the long term. So these are some of the difficulties. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to do this kind of evaluation though anyway. The fourth one, and I realize this is a lot to take in, so you're going to have the handout just to remind you at the end, is that of the common good. So while utilitarianism accepts that there will be some winners and some losers, and some people will be harmed by the choices that you make, the common good asks us to focus on the conditions that are required for an entire community to flourish as a whole, okay? The conditions and the institutions. So can you give me some example? What are some things that are required for all of us to do well? Healthcare, yeah. Education. Exactly, clear environment, clear water, right? Increasingly, I would argue, cybersecurity, I think, is a condition for the common good, because if you have everything connected to the internet, it becomes that kind of importance, right? So you can see how this lens asks you to look at something else rather than individual rights, right? Or rather than fairness, as we were talking about earlier. So the final of the 5 lenses is that of virtue ethics. So this lens turns back on ourselves and basically says, what kind of person do you want to be? What are the qualities of character or the habits, the traits that we value in people, that we would like to have ourselves? What are some, virtue can sound really old-fashioned, but if I ask you what some virtues are, again, there will be things that we relate to all the time. What are some virtues? What do we value in people's character? Honesty, empathy, compassion, courage, loyalty, right? Fairness, prudence, self-control. These are all virtues. If you take virtues to a far extreme, they can become vices, right? So you have to kind of modulate them sometimes. Virtue ethics also asks you to think about exemplars, about excellence in a particular position. So if you think about an excellent engineer, an excellent technologist, what kind of characteristics, what kind of virtues does such a person have? And that ties in a little bit with a prior conversation we were just saying about who do we think as the stereotypical versus the ideal technologist and engineer, right? So these are the 5 lenses. That's a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot to see, but we are more likely to see it if we are in the habit of looking for it. So again, if we're talking about virtues as also habits that we have, the habit of ethical analysis becomes easier and just becomes ingrained if you do it all the time. And among other things, it makes you better at whatever your job is. You're a better engineer if you do this kind of ethical analysis, and the more you do it. What the ethical lenses do and don't do. They are just tools to manage complexity. They don't eliminate it. In fact, they probably make it worse, right? They will make you see things that you would not have seen otherwise. There are no algorithms to compute the ideal ethical solutions. Ethics rarely allows us to optimize for every relative moral value or good. We just have to recognize that. And they are interpreted and applied by people using their intelligence. I love this line from Patrick Lynn from Cal Poly, who says, they help you show your moral math. Okay. So what we want to do now is just do this together. Folks around the room are going to distribute a case study. It's a real case study. You might have heard about it. And they're going to distribute, so there's going to be a printout of a case study for each of you, and then there are going to be a few printouts of a handout on the framework for ethical decision making. I do not want you to read the whole handout. What I would like you to do is grab one of the cases and then answer the first 2 questions on these. So once they're all distributed, I need you to all look up just so I can clarify what we're doing. Okay, so if everybody has one, before you start reading anything, look up for a second. Look up for 1 second. I know it's really compelling when you have something and especially because you're supposed to do something with it. So the framework handouts are really there only because on the inside, you will see paragraph-long descriptions of the 5 ethical lenses that I just described. So since I'm just asking you to use them, and some of them may be unfamiliar, that's just a reference for you. If you're not sure what the difference was between common good or utilitarianism or whatever, those are just there for reference if you need it, okay? If you have any question, please ask it. But in terms of the case study, what I'd like you to do first is take about 10 minutes to read through it and try to answer the first 2 questions on your own. The 2 questions are, who are the stakeholders? Who are all the people you can think of who are directly or indirectly implicated in this case? And then I would like you as a group, so I would like you to get together. If your table is pretty full, you will need to form 2 groups of 3 or 4 people and try to see the case in front of you through each of the 5 lenses that I just described. Where are rights implicated here? Whose rights? Where do you see issues of justice? Where do you see, how does the utilitarian calculus come out for you? Okay, so each of the 5 lenses, talk them through with your group. So you'll need, even if you have 2 minutes per lens, that's pretty quick, but it still will take a little while. And then we're going to come back together and have a conversation about the entire case and what the lenses helped or didn't help us see. Okay, you're on your own. Please, feel free to ask any questions, though, as you're working through it. I'll wander around. Let's just take a couple of more minutes and then we're going to come back. Actually, rather than in groups, let's together tackle the first question of who are the stakeholders. But I'll give you another couple of minutes to make sure that you sort of flesh that out for yourself. So the question of who are the stakeholders is one of the ones that's included in that sort of algorithm process that I was describing, which, by the way, is on the very back page of that 4-page brochure that I gave you. But it opens in an interesting way the rest of the discussion about the lenses because it asks you to think about, okay, whose rights and who are we talking about here in terms of all the other approaches. So who do you see as stakeholders here? Who are the people directly or indirectly implicated by the creation and release of this data set? Let's just call them out. Okay, the people who are depicted in the photographs. Who else? IBM researchers. Who else? People who are subjected to facial recognition in general, right? This is supposed to improve those algorithms, okay? Yes, which would be society at large. Everybody. Yes, okay, so people who have put photos on Flickr, yes. I'm sorry? Or all of the organizations who would improve their algorithms based on this, right? Other users of the algorithms, who else? Did somebody say IBM itself? Oh, academics as well, yes, because this is primarily aimed at researchers, right? Sorry, I already gave away IBM itself, right? That's one of the actors impacted, yes. And in this case, those would be the people who posted pictures on Flickr, which are not necessarily the same people in the pictures, right? Most of the pictures that people posted on Flickr are not self-portraits, right? So they're the people who were posting and the people in the pictures themselves. Anybody else? Yeah. So again, society at large, because of the way facial recognition may be used and all of the places in which it may be used, right? Anybody else we haven't mentioned? The media outlets that covered it. Legislators or regulators who might be asked to respond to the kind of deployment or this kind of research, right? Sorry? The annotators. Is that, yeah, okay. So I think those would be the IBM researchers who put it together, but yes. So I would say the only group we haven't mentioned so far, which I added finally to my list, are tech ethicists who are going to write the ethics cases based on these kind of things. It's going to happen, right? And by the way, with every kind of this discussion that happens, there's more and more of a call for tech ethicists and for tech ethicists to be embedded in tech companies, et cetera, right? So these are the stakeholders. Now what I would like you to do is turn into groups of 3 or 4 and talk about the case, again, using those lenses. And then we're going to come back together and see what everybody saw. So try to make sure that you get through rights and justice and virtue ethics and utilitarian and common good. So just a reminder, don't forget that we're hoping you will use all of the lenses. So if you haven't talked about what virtues you see at play here, you need to talk about that too, or what are the conditions of the common good that may or may not be implicated. Okay, so just a couple more minutes. Make sure that you have something for each lens. Okay, let's come back and talk about this together. I feel terrible ending what sound like really good conversations out there. That seems like entirely the wrong thing to do, but we're running out of time, so I want to make sure that we get our collective thoughts on this. By the way, I just want to acknowledge that I realize what I'm asking you to do is kind of ridiculous, right? To take what is a complicated case and look at it through 5 different ethical perspectives in, about 10, 12 minutes. That's not the ideal, right? This is just a way of sort of sketching what this would look like if you were doing, a proper ethical analysis. But I think it'll be interesting to see, and I suspect we're going to get quite a bit out of it, even in this really short amount of time. So in terms of rights, what are the rights that you see at play here? And again, here we're not going to try to reach a particular decision. We're going to just see what we can see in this case. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands this case developed in the context of a real effort by a lot of technologists to address something that they had been actively called on, which was that they were not paying attention to bias in the data sets they were working with, right? So it's really a well-intentioned effort to respond to the activists who are saying this is a real problem, right? So take sort of a charitable perspective on the whole thing. But what are the rights that we're talking about here? Any that you saw, yeah. Right to privacy, absolutely. Any others? Consent, right? Sort of autonomy, the ability to make your own choices about what happens with things like your data. Any others? Yeah. Anonymity, potentially, right? We can have a long conversation about whether we have that in public, especially or not, but absolutely. Any others? Ownership of your likeness. So sort of data, almost property rights. Right, the right to be treated fairly, right? To feel like you're an equal participant in society. The right to be told the truth, implicated here, I think. Okay. What about the justice aspect? What are some issues where fairness comes into play? So the failure of the current algorithms to recognize people equally, or the sort of the lack of, okay. So the algorithms, the facial recognition algorithms not serving society equally or equally well. What other things seemed fair or unfair? Yeah. Absolutely. And I will say these are things where the case doesn't speak to that directly. We don't have all the facts, and that's often the case, right? So one of the steps in the framework for ethical decision making is make sure you have the relevant facts. So here, there's only a subset that we even know about what they're doing. Yeah. Yes, other issues of fairness. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and that's a whole separate issue. What they try to do here is to put in some very objective measures of faces, like even literally measure things, as opposed to try to have something labeled by other people, like this is female, this is male, or this is, of this particular ethnicity, but to really try to make it kind of more objective in order to answer some of those questions. Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is that there are concerns that this data set thinks, or that the creators think this is a more fair data set, or it will lead to better outcomes, and that there's kind of skepticism about whether it really kind of reflects society in all its nuance. Which I think leads to one of the questions about fairness. In the description that the researchers put out, they said most people agree that a fairer world is a better world. And here there's a question over a fairer world is the same as fairer AI systems, right? You can have fairer AI systems and you can have more accurate facial recognition, and that doesn't necessarily mean a fairer world, right? And that's one of the interesting, really broad debates around this whole issue, is that for a while there were certain activists who said, oh, this algorithm fails to recognize me, fails to identify me, that's a feature, not a bug. right? The pushback I would have against that is these algorithms are being deployed right now in all kinds of places. So no, it's not a feature if you're having all these false positives actually happen to people, right? Now we're just deploying bad algorithms. So there's this whole discussion, do you improve the algorithms and the effectiveness and the accuracy, or do you ban them? Or do you ban them while you're working on making them more accurate? Or do you ban them in certain circumstances but not others? So the third question that I didn't ask you to look at, and we're not going to get to today, but I think is important, is are there ways to reconcile values or to respect our relevant interests? So are there ways to actually make things better, to think creatively about what are the contexts in which something might be worth doing, while in others it's not? It's not an either or necessarily, but it may be an either or while we're working on the algorithms, as in don't deploy them when they're flawed and when you know they're hurting people right now, right? Which unfortunately is the opposite of where we are. We are deploying them at scale, not just facial recognition, but many algorithms in critical situations without testing them, and then finding out 3 years later that they had something like 90-some% false positive rates in some cases. This really happened. So fairness issues, major fairness issues. What about utilitarian calculus? Where did you guys come out on this in terms of benefits versus harms? So you're talking about the sort of harm versus benefit within the users of Flickr or the people whose faces are involved. What about more broadly? Like if you had to, okay, so the goal here is fair algorithms, right? Does that feel like a more of a benefit than the potential harms? Yes. I love that, by the way. There's also a disinformation table. That's what those guys are working on. Yeah. So yeah. Right. So, but I think no. I think you're absolutely right. That where you use the lens, at what level, is really important. Are we talking about the benefits versus harms of effective facial recognition algorithms, or are we talking about the societal benefits versus harms of having facial recognition technology deployed in the first place? Right. Which can be, we can talk about security and the effort to try to recognize, criminals or whatever, versus everything you talked about earlier today, right? Were there other things that came up when you were trying to do that utilitarian calculus? Right, absolutely. You have to think about the alternatives, which might give you all the benefits with fewer harms, right? Yes. So it's interesting if we think about, science more broadly and scientific advantage, right? Is that one of the benefits, just advances in our scientific understanding, right? And how do we read that vis-a-vis the other potential benefits, potential harms? Wow, 7 hands just went up on that one. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And also, by the way, we tend to think of research as inherently being kind of connected to the common good. But the people who took the information from Facebook were researchers, were academic researchers that then worked with Cambridge Analytica, right? So just being an academic or doing something for research doesn't mean it's not part of that broader conversation about benefits and harms that we're talking about. Yes. Yeah, I was about to say, so that actually goes to the fairness issue, right? Why researchers and not, say, activist groups who might want to use it instead, right? Why do we assume that the researchers are sort of by definition the good guys, even though they're trying now, even with the researchers, to say, you need to tell us what is the purpose. We're going to try to make some decisions ourselves about when we grant access to this. But the questions are really complex, right? So what's particularly interesting in this case is this data set was collected very intentionally. Unlike the data sets you're talking about, we'll just collect everything and figure out what we're going to do with it. This was collected specifically in order to try to create a societal benefit and to make things more fair. But I think you're right that I think this points to a tension between what we often hear about tech for good, tech for social good, and what I would call ethical tech. So the outcome is not the only thing that counts. Even if you agree that fair algorithm is what we want and that's a great outcome, the ethics of data collection, the implication to people's rights in terms of how you even collect the data, how you store it, who do you give access to, all of those things are part of ethical tech that don't get expressed if you just hear tech for good, because they're concentrating on what they hope will be a positive outcome. And by the way, somebody was talking earlier about hating the word cyber. This is how I feel when I hear about harvesting data. Harvesting makes it sound so wholesome, you know, it's like a whole wheat kind of thing. And I keep thinking that's a terrible metaphor, right? I mean, I would rather just call it collecting and, you know, but yeah, we have some interesting language to talk about this. I agree. No, I completely agree. So just because we're running short on time and because I want to go through all 5 lenses, we haven't talked directly, although we've been touching already on it, on the common good. What are the common good conditions that are impacted here? We talked a little bit about just having a fairer society in which people feel like they're being treated equally like everybody else. That's, I would say, a condition of the common good. What are some others? Yeah. I get that, and I think what maybe it kind of goes back to in terms of conditions for the common good, I would argue that privacy is one of the conditions required for the common good that gets implicated by a lot of these technologies and a lot of these uses. So if we are undermining privacy, that would be a problem. Other conditions, just again, of the common good, if we're looking overall, yes. And 2 different communities, right? Because if you're talking about the community of researchers, and here, by the way, they're trying to, they could have just created this for themselves and use it as a business advantage and say, we have the better annotated data set, we're going to have the fairest algorithms, you should buy our stuff, right? They're actually trying to share with the research community. And on the flip side, it's not clear that they've thought broadly enough about the community outside the research community and whether they consulted with people who might be impacted, who might have concerns about this, or at least it was not reflected in the way they communicated about this. Maybe they had these discussions, right? But that's talking about showing your moral math, right? If you work through that, you know, it might be that you as a researcher or as a company or as a, you know, technologist reach a certain decisions that other people will disagree with, but explain how you thought it through and why you made certain choices, right? And then we can discuss what's more ethical or less ethical and who decides that. But there's a sort of a missing component to the announcement here, which is very focused on fairness and on wanting to make a fairer world, but misses a lot of these other elements, right? So really quickly, because we really are just about out of time, what virtues come into play here? And I will start with one. The fact that they are sharing this suggests generosity, right? That's one virtue. They're not trying to make money out of it. They're not selling it. They're not building product for sale. Yeah. Or the flip side, you think that by doing this, you are being more trustworthy because you are making efforts to build something carefully and more fairly, right? That makes you more trustworthy. Other virtues. So and I think there's compassion implied there too, right? So yeah, I mean, so there's a question of respect, right? They didn't just go and scrape everything. They were trying to only scrape things that were publicly allowed and open. Maybe a failure of empathy, not of compassion, to not really understand how other people might perceive this and why, you know, once the story came out the way it did, people are not happy. Any other virtues? So conscience or conscientiousness. Prudence, maybe in terms of doing this and how, or lack thereof. I'm just saying virtues implicated, not virtues necessarily expressed by the people, right? Technically, you know, you can say intellectual curiosity, right? There are a lot of virtues at play, and the virtues don't guarantee an ethical outcome, right? I think that's one thing that I think is really interesting from the whole conversation. That there's a lot of balancing to be done. You see what I mean about the complexity that comes out if you start to really think about these things. I think, again, this was a really well-intentioned effort on their part, but it missed a lot of spots where I'm hoping that what you got out of this is that the ethical lenses do help you see things you would not have seen otherwise, even if you went in, and sometimes we have kind of a preference for a particular ethical perspective. So here, like the fairness was so squarely the goal there, right? That somehow the rights and the common good and the other things kind of got lost. The other thing I hope you got, and I was watching you all, is that you do see more when you look at all of this in a group, right? If you were just reading the case study by yourself, even with the help of the lenses or anything else, having that conversation. And this is why, when we talk about diversity in tech, we're not just talking about, this sort of noble ideal, but it actually helps, develop better informed people and communities, and if those people are the technologists, then better products. And we're seeing, especially in the context of healthcare and data, because again, the potential benefits are so great and we are so hopeful for new cures, and that a lot of the how you get there people start to pay less attention to that. And it's fascinating to watch the whole discussion in the last few days about data sharing agreements between, Google and hospitals, and various other entities, and how do you handle that so that people really are protected. And there are things we haven't talked about, like differential privacy and like federated learning. There are ways of trying to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms that we haven't really talked about at all. So how do we make sure that those get pushed to the forefront? I'm going to stop because I'm actually over time. I apologize. I will just put this up. So there are lots of free resources at scu.edu/ethics, including the framework, and a whole ethics toolkit if you want to talk about how do you implement some of these decisions and discussions into the actual process of developing and designing and deploying products. Please follow up with me if you have any questions, or you would like to just continue the conversation. That's my email, and I'm on Twitter at iEthics. Thank you very much.